people to have really clear soundbite answers for things. So,
oh yeah,
some of the interviews were kind of funny. It's like they would want you to say something really definitive, and you're like, well, the data doesn't actually show that. So yeah, it was kind of an interesting exercise in learning about how the public perceives your work.
That's a great point. I mean, I don't know if you remember, I grew up with a talk show host for a father, so I learned that they want what's sensational, what's going to get people excited or upset or whatever.
Right.
In this episode, you'll get to know Jason Wood, the Stoic scientist, and you'll hear the story of how he developed a successful career as a research scientist while still carving out time for family and playing the fiddle. I'm Dave Crenshaw, and this is my Success Project. Welcome back, friends, to the Dave Crenshaw Success Project. This is the show where I'm teaching my children how to be successful through the life stories of others, and you get to come along for the ride no matter what your age is. In case it's your first time here, I'm a best-selling author. I speak around the world to Fortune 500 companies, and millions of people have taken my courses that have helped them become more successful. With this show, I wanted to create something a little different, something that would help my family succeed, but I thought you would also enjoy learning along with them. My goal is to speak to some of the most successful people I've met in my life's journey, particularly people who have achieved not just financial or career success, but multifaceted success in many areas of their lives. And today's guest, I'm really excited about interviewing him. First of all, because I realized I hadn't yet had a scientist on the show, and this guy's a brilliant scientist, but also because I've known him for quite a long time. We were friends in high school. We even did some music together in talent shows. He's someone that I've admired for quite a while, not just because of his genius, but because he has made family and making time for fun a huge priority in his life. So, without further ado, Jason Wood is an associate principal scientist at Alkermes with over 20 years of experience studying the biology of aging, metabolism, epigenetics, and neurodegeneration. In his current role, he supports multiple projects in oncology and neurobiology with a focus on functional genomics. Jason has a PhD in biological and biomedical sciences from Harvard Medical School. In his free time, Jason enjoys playing his fiddle and spending time with his family. Jason, it's an honor to have you here.
It's good to see you again, and thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah. So the last time that we spoke was pretty much near the end of high school. We did exchange some emails a little bit during the COVID years.
Yeah.
So, Jason, I always like to ask, where are you located today? Where are you speaking to me from?
I am currently in Waltham, Massachusetts, a suburb of Boston. That's where my work is, and I live in Providence, Rhode Island, about 40 miles south of here.
It seems like a beautiful area. I have not been to Providence, but it seems like that would be a fantastic place to live.
I will tell you, it's very nice this time of year because all of our maple trees are turning red and the colors are out in full force. So it's a lovely time of year.
Oh, that sounds beautiful. Next time I get in the area, we'll have to connect so I can see that area. Yeah, so I always like to ask my guests the same question when we start, because we're going to follow your career path. And the first question is, when you were first forming your ideas about what you were really going to do for a career, what did you think you would be when you grew up, so to speak?
Yeah, good question. I've always been attracted to science, I think, since I was a kid and kind of knowing how things worked. So I would say, fairly early on, I figured it would be kind of something either in, say, computers, computer science, or, some other aspect of science. That's kind of what I've always been drawn to.
So we went to the same high school, and it's not often I get to interview someone that we went to high school with. Was that what you were pursuing during high school, or was it more broad in terms of your interests?
I think, certainly by the end of high school, I had kind of zeroed in on wanting to do something scientific for a career. I think at that point, I ended up going into biology, and I think that wasn't necessarily decided, but I was kind of on that path, although, I, of course, enjoyed a lot of other things as well. But I would say I'd zeroed in on science, but not necessarily the, subdomain of science at that point.
And It seems like in every high school class, I mean, there's one person that is extremely intelligent and everyone looks at and says, well, there's somebody who's going to succeed. That was my perception of you in high school. And I think it was for a lot of other people. The question that I want to ask, though, is, was that how you perceived yourself? Were you valedictorian or you were like right there next to it?
Yeah, well, we didn't have a valedictorian because they didn't want to make non-valedictorians feel bad, as I recall. So we didn't officially have one.
Okay. But again, like, I think most people are like, man, Jason Wood, he's a genius. He's going to go somewhere.
You guys are very kind.
But sometimes I think it's hard to feel that way about yourself.
Yeah, I think there was a core of us that did really well in school. And I certainly saw myself as being in that group, but I don't think I would have thought of myself as the genius of the school, but I always did well in school. And so, I guess I perceived that I was kind of in that group of smart kids, I guess we'll call it.
Okay. That's good to know, because I think sometimes people kind of doubt themselves when they shouldn't. And that led to you getting a very wonderful opportunity, which is to go to school at Harvard.
Right.
Which was pretty far away from where we were. Did that move seem intimidating to you, or were you ready? Were you really excited to get out and go across the country?
I would say very much the former. It was an intimidating move, a move away from what I had grown up with. I think like culturally maybe is the best way to describe that. So it was on the East Coast. It was kind of a different group of people that were there. So I was excited for it, but at the same time, yeah, it was apprehensive. And that was a difficult adjustment, I think, for the first, year or two. By the end, I loved it.
Yeah. Well, and Utah certainly has a very unique culture.
True. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
I mean, I live here. This is where my family is. But having spent a lot of time on the East Coast for work purposes, it feels almost like you're on a different planet. It's a wonderful planet to go to, but compared to Utah, there's a lot of cultural adjustments.
Yes.
Can you remember any moments where you thought, okay, I'm not in Utah anymore, or moments where you realized, hey, I need to adjust the way that I'm doing things?
Well, I think that was pretty obvious through most of my time there fairly immediately. I will say, I did embrace things that I think were new and exciting to me, mostly about living in a city. So, I lived in Cambridge and it was very vibrant and diverse and full of interesting things going on in the street. And I loved that. Like my first year, I would just wander around listening to street musicians and think, wow, this is really cool. But yeah, I think moving to a place that was so different from where I had grown up was definitely a constant adjustment, I think. Or, you're constantly reminded that this is kind of different from where you came from.
Yeah. And well, it seems like you've continued to embrace that. That's where the area you live and are raising your family now.
I've been here for 30 years now and I love it. So I don't know if that counts as one of the locals in New England terms, but it's been a while now. So
I'd give you credit.
All right,
I'd do it. So going to school at Harvard, I think it's almost romanticized. I think it's like, oh man, what an amazing school to go to. Talk to me a little bit about what that was like. The perception as an outsider is that it's extremely difficult. Was that your feeling as you were going to school there?
I very much applied kind of on a whim. And, I think it was with what you just mentioned, that sort of romantic notion. Oh, it's, one of the best schools in the country. I applied just to see if I could get in. Surprisingly, I did. And, my parents pulled some strings and we worked it out. And I decided to go because I think even at the time I realized it wasn't maybe the comfortable choice, but it was a choice that would allow me a lot of options and I think would ultimately be good for me. As far as, is it difficult? Yes, it is difficult. I think it seems normal once you're there and are part of the community versus, looking in from the outside. So, I mean, that was my college experience and that was all I knew. So it became normal.
Yeah. And you rose to the challenge that they were throwing at you.
Yeah, I would say that. Yeah, the education was great. The thing I most appreciated, I think, was the ability to interact with the group of students who were all really bright and motivated. And that kind of opened me up to a world of, I guess, possibilities and being exposed to that crowd, which I think was not the culture that I had grown up in, I think was really interesting and gave me a lot of, good perspectives on what was possible.
So you bring up a really interesting point, and part of what I'm doing with this podcast, with this show, is I'm looking for universal principles of success. And one thing that you're highlighting is the power of networking, of finding a mastermind group, of finding a group of people who are trying to accomplish similar things to you, and you all help each other. Talk to me a little bit more about that group and the influence that they had on you and your future career.
Sure. If you think about like at a university, the quality of instruction, that's probably pretty similar across a lot of places. Faculty, it's really hard to get those jobs. So there's a lot of great faculty. So, as I mentioned, for me, the student body was kind of the differentiator. The way I think of it is there was kind of this idea of the maybe elite is the right word, but people that sort of were in positions of power, whether that be in business or government or anything really, as being kind of far away, distant, unapproachable. And I was kind of thrown in with a group of kids who in many cases had, connections and parents who were in that world. And, it's interesting to look back now, 30 years later, many of my peers have moved into exactly those positions. So, that's, I guess, what I mean when I say it kind of opened up that world, as thinking of that more as a thing maybe I could do rather than a thing that's kind of imposed from outside by a group of outsiders.
Well, that's interesting right there, because what I've found in my career is often I had perceptions of myself, perceptions of what I could accomplish in my career, and they were limited.
Yeah.
And then I would come across somebody who was doing something really exceptional. And I know them and I'm like, this is an average person and they're doing something awesome. Like, for one example, is my friend Jason Hewlett, who, was at the time that I met him making far, far more money as a speaker than I was. And he'd share the number with me and I go, well, I can do that, right? So it sounds kind of like that, where you're seeing other people accomplish these remarkable things and it sort of raises the bar in your own mind about what you can accomplish.
Yeah, that's a very good way to describe it because, as you mentioned, I became kind of integrated into that system and realized that I had basically the same qualifications and abilities as most of these other people. So I try to surround myself with people that are better than me at whatever I want to get good at, whether that's, anything, sports, music, anything. And so that was kind of an environment that allowed me to do that. But at the same time, made me realize, there's nothing stopping me from going in those directions either.
I love that phrase you just used. Surround yourself with people who are better than me in a variety of areas, because I think a lot of people don't like that. I think a lot of people run away from that because it can be a challenge to your ego.
Yeah, I guess it can be somewhat uncomfortable. Yeah.
So far as we're describing this, I think the perception of a listener might be, well, this all sounds like this was smooth sailing. So talk to me a little bit about adversity that you experienced, whether it's in college or early on in your career after you graduated from Harvard.
Thinking back to my college time, one thing that was, a bit difficult is, so my family didn't have a lot of money at the time, and it was, of course, fairly expensive. So I had to work while I was there. It's over 20 hours a week, working at the library to help pay for tuition and stuff. So that did kind of limit my ability to engage in things like extracurriculars and stuff. And, most of my peers were not in that situation. I think ultimately it was good and taught me some important lessons about prioritizing time and things like that. But that was one area where I was like acutely aware that I was different from many of my peers, we'll say. In terms, grad school, I don't know that there was anything in particular adversity I can think of moving in that direction, other than it just being graduate school and it's hard and takes a lot of time.
So this is actually pretty interesting to me. And you can either dispel this myth or you can confirm it, but it almost adds to the legend of Jason Wood in my mind, because there's something about the way that you approach life and things where I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying that, but in your mind, it's not too big of a challenge. And my perception is that you have a very even keel and that you have confidence that, hey, we'll figure it out. Like, you're in control and you don't let your emotions get the best of you. How accurate is that perception?
I would describe that as very accurate. I think of myself, in fact, when I was kind of mulling over on my drive up today, some things we could discuss about, I think of my personality as being exactly the phrase you used, which is even keeled. So, I mean, that can kind of be a double-edged sword, right? Because you want to have like passion for things that kind of, drive you to really pursue them. But at the same time, I think I have kind of a certain stoicism about things. And I think that's allowed me to maybe roll with the changes a little bit and kind of temper disappointments that come up in work or life or whatever. So I do think of myself in that way. The jury's out on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's at least, I think, how I am.
It's both.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Jason, I teach a course on LinkedIn Learning called Turning Weaknesses into Strengths. And I also have another course called Discovering Your Strengths. And my perspective in working with executives and coaching leaders is no matter what your personality is, there are some really positive benefits and there's some things that associated with that you can't let go of. If you pick up a strength, you're also going to pick up some weaknesses. So like you said, maybe you don't demonstrate the emotion quite as much, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe people feel that you're a little too stoic. But the strength side of that is exactly what we're talking about. You know what? You're even keel. You're going to deal with things and nothing is going to feel like that big of a challenge. And it doesn't surprise me too because of your background, or rather your career as a scientist. My guess is that is a very, very important strength where you don't take the failure of a hypothesis or the hypothesis proved incorrect or your research not going the way you perceived it might. You don't take that as a negative. You just take it in stride and you say, okay, let's test it again.
Yeah, no, that's a good way to describe it. I mean, in science, most things go wrong, I would say. The things generally don't work out the way you expect them to. So I think it has been a positive, I guess, personality trait in that regard professionally. So yeah, you described it very well. Stuff doesn't work out and you kind of have to be able to deal with that in a somewhat dispassionate way and just look at the data and realize what it's telling you and refocus.
Yeah. I heard someone say once to me that experiments don't fail. Hypotheses are just proven incorrect. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. I mean, sometimes they do fail, like when instruments go wrong and stuff. But yes, I would agree with the gist of that statement. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I guess if the test didn't complete fully the way you intended, then yeah, that's a failure, right?
Right. But even dealing with failures like that can be frustrating. So.
Right. And it seems like when something like that happens, because of your personality, because of your perspective, you just kind of say, all right, let's do it again. Let's do it a different way, right? The water rolls off your back, so to speak.
I try to let it, yes.
So you completed a PhD from Harvard Medical School, which just blows my mind. Man, Jason, I was barely lucky enough to get my bachelor's. I couldn't handle school very well with my ADHD. That was extremely difficult to get that. So I'm in awe that you were able to accomplish that. Talk to me just a little bit, or those who are not familiar with it, with the process of obtaining a PhD. Because I don't think I've interviewed anyone yet who has achieved that.
Yeah, I mean, a PhD is very different from a bachelor's degree at university, where generally you're, taking classes and that's kind of the focus, right? A PhD is a research degree, so you will find a specific research project, you will get into it very deeply, you will generate data, hypotheses, and the goal is to spend, well, in science, it's usually 5 or 6 years kind of developing a project and hopefully coming up with some contribution to the body of knowledge in whatever your field is. So it's very much, less classroom focused and more kind of practice focused. In my case, it was molecular biology. So I was in the lab, I was learning techniques, I was learning how to do science. So a very different focus from an undergraduate degree. But, in a way, it's more like working.
What was your thesis paper?
So I worked on, let's see how much detail to give. I was in a lab that studied the biology of aging. So my thesis topic was looking in both yeast and nematodes, so little roundworms, dissecting some of these genetic pathways that controlled longevity and how that is governed.
Man, that's fascinating.
It was fun work.
That is Really cool stuff. And what did you learn from those tests? If you were to summarize it for us mere mortals who don't deal with that kind of thing,
Yeah.
what did you gain? What did you add to the body of knowledge?
Yeah, it was, I think, an interesting time in the world of aging biology because that was, at a time when it was just kind of getting off the ground and people were starting to explore those mechanisms. So, I think we were looking at the interplay between metabolism and aging, and there's definitely a very strong link there, which, people are still working on. One of the key observations was made almost 100 years ago, which is if you restrict calories, animals tend to live longer. So a lot of the work in that field has been trying to figure out why that is. So I contributed to a couple projects that tried to sort of dissect that calorie restriction pathway.
Was there something in your life in particular that made you interested in that topic of aging? Or was it just something that fascinated you with no particular background?
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, I kind of fell into it a little bit. I was interested in human disease and cancer biology originally. And then my graduate advisor had just started there the same year I did, and he was interested in aging. And, the idea is kind of by looking at the processes that govern aging, you can kind of attack a bunch of different diseases at once, since many diseases are, in some sense, diseases of aging, like cancer, neurodegenerative disease, all of those become much more prevalent with advanced age. So that was the, I guess, central idea behind it that really appealed to me, was the ability to not look at a single disease, but kind of a constellation of diseases that are all associated with aging and what does it mean to age. So I wouldn't say that like I had gone in there intending to study that, but when the opportunity became available, it really appealed to me for those reasons. So that's why I went in that direction.
Yeah. And when we were doing research for this conversation, my understanding is when you were studying these things, the media reached out with some of your studies.
Yeah.
What did you learn from that process of interacting with the media?
Yeah, so that was fun. I was involved in a project where we were looking into a molecule called resveratrol, and we had, done some work suggesting that it could extend the lifespan of yeast and worms and things like that. And because that is a component of red wine, it really caught the media's attention. And so, I ended up, I think at one point, giving an interview to a radio station in Argentina, in which my boss had passed my way. And, they were very interested in what kind of wine is the best to drink to extend your lifespan. And so I think in terms of lessons I learned, there's a need for scientists to communicate their research to the lay public because, frequently it's very easy to take things out of context when, you don't have the background and the training. So I think part of our job as scientists is to kind of guide that discussion a little bit. The other thing that's tricky is scientists by nature tend to be fairly reserved about what the data actually shows you, right? You don't want to overstate your case. And I think that kind of goes against the desire of people to have really clear soundbite answers for things. So,
oh yeah,
some of the interviews were kind of funny. It's like they would want you to say something really definitive, and you're like, well, the data doesn't actually show that. So yeah, it was kind of an interesting exercise in learning about how the public perceives your work.
That's a great point. I mean, I don't know if you remember, I grew up with a talk show host for a father, so I learned that they want what's sensational, what's going to get people excited or upset or whatever.
Right.
So yeah, being a scientist, you're trying to like give them something interesting, but also be like, well, you're taking things a little too far here.
There's nuance involved. That's important, right? So
yeah. Is there a particular...
That can be a tricky line to walk.
Exactly. Is there a particular thought that you keep in mind or a way that you approach things when you're trying to explain complex scientific research to people who have no understanding of it? Like, what's the trick you use to do that?
Well, my wife is a non-scientist, so I think, practice kind of explaining things to her. But like anything, so I think a really important part of presenting is to know your audience as much as you can, right? And their background. And that's not always possible, but you can tailor a message in many different ways depending on who you're speaking to. So me speaking to a room full of biologists is going to be very different from me speaking to a room full of scientists, which will be different me speaking to people without scientific background. So, the goal is to put yourself in your audience's shoes and kind of distill the important parts of what you're trying to communicate and tailor them to the audience. That's a really tricky skill. I wouldn't say that I'm an expert at it, but that's something that I've tried to hone, I think, as I've gotten older and a little further along in my career. Because I think no matter what you do, that becomes a pretty important skill.
Yeah. For those who have been listening to other interviews, I just want to highlight something because here we go again with a universal principle of success, and it came from a scientist. That's part of the reason why I wanted to interview Jason, is because I hadn't interviewed a scientist yet. And you just said another universal principle of success, which is know your audience. And I've heard this from entrepreneurs. I've heard this from writers. I've heard this from people in sales. It's so critical to understand who it is that you're speaking to put yourself in their shoes, and then communicate from a standpoint that grabs their attention and grabs their understanding so that you can persuade them about whatever it is that you're trying to talk about.
I could not agree more. And I've been surprised how much persuading there is in science, too.
Really? Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in an industry role now, and a lot of the job is not just generating data, but communicating that data to different parts of the organization and, getting buy-in from various people. And so there is a lot of audience tailoring even within an organization, that like where I am now, that is focused on a common goal and generally where people have a scientific background. So even in specific situations like this, there's a lot of persuasion involved, I think, or stating your case, I guess we'll say that.
Yeah. Well, I'm assuming getting funding, getting buy-in from key shareholders or stakeholders, I'm assuming that's all part of that process, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So for a large part, probably the largest part of your career, right, you were at universities, right? You were at Brown University. Is that correct?
Yep. That's correct.
So talk to me a little bit about what that part of your career journey was like, what it's like to be a fellow or an assistant research professor.
Sure. So the normal, I guess, academic career path in biology or other sciences is to do a postdoctoral fellowship after your PhD. So, the training path is very long here. And that lasts for a number of years, usually 5 or 6 years. And then you kind of ideally move to a faculty role. So I had come to Brown to work with the professor who I'd actually done some work with in graduate school. I moved to working on fruit flies, kind of still the same general area of biology, looking at aging biology. So, that was a good, I think, a formative time. A postdoctoral fellowship is a time where you basically just have to do science, and the goal is to kind of prepare you for a professorship. So I stayed there for a while, and then I moved into a research assistant professor role, which is a kind of non-tenure track research role. And I was there for a number of years, and, there's a lot of advantages to being in a university setting in terms of interaction with students and I think, the greater university community and things that are not science that are going on is really fun to be involved with that. So I was there for quite a while.
Yeah. So is teaching in the classroom a part of that, or is it more conducting studies and doing hands-on research, or is it a blend of both? What's that like?
Yes. So, I mean, it depends on the position. Usually a postdoc, you will generally just be doing research. There might be, some opportunities for teaching. So I was a teaching fellow actually back at Harvard for the cell biology class for a few years, really enjoyed that. But in general, the goal was to do research, write papers. That's kind of the role of a postdoc usually.
So let's talk about that a little bit more. I mean, we kind of talked about your personality and how that lent itself to research. But let's say that I want to embark on a career like this, where I'm a research professor, scientist, that sort of thing. First of all, what's a day in my life? I wake up, I go to work, and what am I doing at work?
As a professor?
Let's start with just on the research side of it, where you're doing research for the university.
Yeah. Generally, you'll go in and perform experiments or analyze data. That's really kind of the core of it. There's obviously a lot of meetings to plan experiments, make sure they're properly conducted, but there's a lot of, time at the bench actually executing them. And then the data analysis is frequently an overlooked part, but especially, nowadays biology is getting very much driven by big data sets. So there's more, say, coding and sort of computational resources that come in. So a day in terms of doing research might involve anything from pipetting things at the bench to looking at analyzing data to writing code to visualizing things, putting together presentations, all of the above. Now, as a professor, your other job is to find funding for your research. And that's a whole kind of a whole other side of the
Oh, wow.
job that I think is not well appreciated from outsiders. So it's a lot of work. You have to write grants and nobody likes doing that, but you do need money to run your projects.
Yeah, which is part of a sales process, right? I know most scientists would not think of themselves as being in sales, but that is what you're doing, right?
Yeah, in many ways, it's very similar to running a small business if you're an academic professor, in that you need to bring in revenue, which is generally grant money, so you're writing proposals to the government to get funding. You employ a bunch of people that do the work, and your output is scientific papers. But the kind of day-to-day process is probably somewhat similar. You have to kind of keep everything in balance and make sure you have enough money to pay people. And it's not quite as different as you might imagine, I think.
Yeah. Is it government that you were typically trying to get the funding from? Was it any private parties or was it mostly the government?
Yeah, that's where most of it comes from. So the NIH, National Institutes of Health, is the big funder of biomedical research in the US. There's also quite a few charitable foundations that do provide grants, which are frequently kind of specific for diseases. American Heart Association or any of the cancer organizations usually have like a grant making arm. So it's a combination of, whatever is out there, but the lion's share comes directly from the federal government.
So yeah, here's a perfect example of strengths and weaknesses. There have been only a couple of times in my career where I attempted to maybe get a grant or maybe get approved for some sort of organization. I guess in my case, it's been like applying to speak at an event. And it drained the life from me, Jason.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, and I've made a choice. I'm never going to do anything like that again.
If you talk to science professors, I'm sure they will agree with you.
Okay. So you still experience that pain.
Good way to describe it.
Yeah. Your personality allows you to do that. I mean, I'm assuming that also it's in itself is like writing a research paper every time you need to get funding. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, there's an art to it, but it is pretty similar. Soul draining is a good way to describe it. It's a part of the job I think nobody really loves, but it just has to be done. So,
yeah, that's fascinating. Okay, so I know, Jason, for you, family is extremely important, and that's something I admire about you. You mentioned your wife once. At what point in this journey did you meet her and that relationship start to unfold?
So we met, it was actually right about the time I was finishing graduate school and she was finishing law school. So we were both, I think, around 30 years old. We met at that point, dated for a while, actually long distance. She moved to Washington, D.C. for about a year, came back and we got married. So we just celebrated our 16th anniversary.
Oh, that's fantastic. Congratulations. So what role has your marriage played in your overall success? What's your perception of that?
So, for me, the family stuff is ultimately, I think for most people, more important than the career stuff, I think. And of course, as I've had children, that's kind of brought an added dimension in. On a practical note, one other thing is that the training path I described is not well compensated. So having a spouse who was supportive and had a good income kind of allowed me to do that for a long time. Whereas if I had been solely responsible for supporting a family, I probably would not have been able to. So,
And was that a conversation that you had with your wife? You said, hey, this is the path and we're going to figure out a way to make this work for the meantime?
Yeah, I don't know if it was really like that clearly articulated. I mean, she knew that I wanted to go down that path. And I think the fact that, she had a good job allowed us to do things like buy a house and stuff, which I probably wouldn't have been able to otherwise. But honestly, I think, having kids was really the big change, right? I think that's a kind of a much larger life adjustment than getting married.
Okay. Talk to me about how that affected things with your career.
Yeah. So raising kids is, of course, very difficult because you've got a full life and, work and everything. And then you have to kind of shoehorn many more hours a day of child rearing in there. So I think that can be a really big stressor.
How many children do you have?
I have two kids. They're 7 and 5, two boys. If you don't have family support nearby, I feel that it's really difficult to have two people. If we're just now talking about like a sort of two-parent traditional family, I know there's lots of different arrangements, but it's hard to have both people have a job that's really demanding and inflexible and have children. It just doesn't work because like they get sick, school closes down, like somebody needs that flexibility. So
Yeah.
for me, my job had that flexibility, and that was a big contributor to me staying in that role for so long, was the ability to kind of, take off and go pick up the kids if I needed to.
That's great. And do you structure your days and weeks with the understanding that that's going to happen from time to time? Because I know a lot of times people pack their schedule too full and then something like that happens and then it's like everything's in chaos. It doesn't seem like that's affecting you very much. So I'm kind of asking a
Yeah.
structural question, like on a tactical level, what do you do to make sure that you can help and respond to those needs when they pop up?
Yeah, it never seems to come at a good time. So, I'm in a different job now, right? And I would say it is a little bit less flexible. I think the kids have gotten a little bit older, so it works out. And meanwhile, I think my wife's at a point in her career where she has a little more flexibility. So, the current dynamic is we kind of share those duties. Luckily, my employer is very understanding when things come up. So, you just make it work, I guess. It's never ideal and stuff always seems to happen at a bad time, but, we figure it out.
Yeah. The sense I'm getting is that you and your wife have a degree of flexibility and fluidity in the way that you're sharing those responsibilities.
Yes, I would say that's the case. Yep. Life's definitely starting to get busier with activities for the kids. So that's kind of another dimension that's coming in now.
Yeah, I think I saw a post that you recently made about one of your sons was playing baseball. Was that right?
Yeah, we're doing baseball, soccer, swim, all sorts of stuff, violin lessons. So it's a busy time.
Yeah. And now you're entering the Uber driver phase of parenting. We're in the middle of that as well.
Yes, exactly. Shuttling people around here. That'll last for a while.
Yeah.
I remember being on the other end of that growing up. So
Yeah. Well, and the one thing that's good is once your oldest hits 16, then you get a free Uber driver. So that's been a nice thing for our family for a bit.
I know. I'm looking forward to that.
Just not the training part of that. That was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life.
Oh, right.
But
yeah. Well, maybe we'll have self-driving cars by then. We'll see.
Oh, yeah, that would be great. That would be great. So you mentioned your career change. Talk to me a little bit about what caused that career change, because that's a pretty big step to go from academic to a more professional position.
Yeah. So I guess I would describe, it had kind of become clear to me in the role I was in at the university that there wasn't really good potential for career development and advancement just because of the nature of the position I was in. That had been clear for a while, but as I mentioned, it did provide that flexibility for my family, which was very important at the time. So I kind of put off making a potential move to industry, kind of during let's say the COVID reassessment period. I kind of determined that it would be a good time to try to make that move. So I did. So 2 years ago, I left that position at the university and I moved to a pharmaceutical company. I think I was also just feeling a bit in a rut and kind of, wanting to try something new. So I still do science, but of course now it's in a drug development and corporate setting. So kind of the context is very different, but the actual techniques I use are similar to what I did at the university.
What was the biggest thing that you needed to adjust to making that career switch?
So a couple things, for me, it's a much longer commute, right? Because of where I live and where the job center is. And that's a large part of the reason that I didn't move earlier was having to deal with that. So from that perspective, sort of the work at home movement made that transition a little easier, although we are mostly back in the office now. As far as day-to-day stuff, just dealing with the corporate environment, I think has been a big adjustment. There's both good and bad things about, that setup, but that has been kind of a large cultural change in how I do science and think about projects and communication and all of that.
I would think that there's a little bit more freedom to focus on the science because you're not in a position anymore where you have to get funding, right? Or do you still have to make presentations and ask for more funding for projects?
No, I mean, it's very different. Getting money for the research is much less of a concern, I think, at a place like this. There is funding available for research. I think there's more kind of bureaucracy, almost is a good way to say it. So, you have to deal with different business processes and stuff. But yeah, there's no grant writing or anything like that. So that is one advantage of this situation for sure.
So here's a big picture question.
Sure.
You've done a lot of research in the areas of cancer and aging, which are these huge issues that affect people's lives. And I know for myself, one of the biggest concerns that I have, I saw some of my family members as they got older, particularly the men, they started dealing more with dementia, that sort of thing. So this is, I think, a topic that everyone's interested in. My question to you is, with all of this big picture research that you're doing on a personal, tactical level, what things have you changed in your lifestyle that have been informed by the research that you've done?
Ooh, that is a good question. This is not going to shock anyone, but one thing that comes out from the research is things like healthy eating and exercise will really decrease your risk for a lot of things. It's not like a cure-all, but in a lot of cases, that is some of the best advice you can give. As far as, how I've tried to apply that. Personally, my exercise fell off a cliff once I had kids. That's one thing that I kind of let go. So I would like to get back on that wagon, but it's just kind of striking to me how frequently that comes up in the literature. Of course, the effort to develop pharmaceuticals and treatments for these various diseases is something that's very important. And that was honestly somewhat of a driver of my career shift as well, as wanting to be involved more in the sort of applied side of things. Developing treatments that help patients and kind of shifting away from very basic model organism research.
And are you able to make those personal lifestyle adjustments? You find it easier because you know the science behind it?
Oh, I don't know. I find it easier to know that's what I should do. The actual execution can be tricky for lifestyle changes, I would say, for everyone. So,
yeah. Well, I appreciate the honesty with that. And that's kind of the reason why I asked it, because sometimes knowing something is different than doing something.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm a big believer in coaching, because I know if I didn't have someone kind of nipping at my heels, I probably wouldn't do the things that I'm supposed to, even with the knowledge that I've got.
Yeah, there's a good argument to be made for that, for sure.
Last thing I want to cover, and then we'll get into the wrap up of it. Something that I really admire about you, and honestly, Jason, you kind of make me feel a little guilty about when I see it, is how much time you spend on your hobbies of music. And I say guilty because you and we spent some time playing music together. I remember doing a talent show with you where I played banjo.
We had a few collaborations back in the day. Yep.
Yeah. I played banjo. You played guitar. We played The Lone Gunman together. You remember that song that I put together?
I do. Yeah.
Yeah. And I got in a rollover accident in California, broke the banjo. And at that point, that kind of ended my banjo playing. So when I see you doing this and spending time on it, I'm like, man, look at him go. Look at him do that. Maybe I should do that, but I'm not. So just talk to me about the role that your hobbies have played in the quality of your life and how you make that a part of it.
Yeah, well, don't worry. I'm not actually very good at any of those things, but
that doesn't matter.
So I really feel that having hobbies or some sort of outlet that is not work, and maybe not even family, is like hugely important for, let's just say, mental health. And so, that can take the form of sports or outdoor activities or whatever. For me, it's a lot of music. So I have found a very good community around that, and kind of, I sang in a choir for a really long time, and that was great. And more recently, I've kind of got into the world of folk and traditional music, which I love, and have found a great community there. So everybody kind of has to decide what's really important for them. For me, taking some time to pursue that is very important. And, my wife understands that, and we kind of trade off, and she has her things she likes to do. So I think having that outlet is really key, and actually, makes you focus better at work too. So it's been really,
Yes,
I think, a very positive experience for my overall life, let's say. It's just a lot of fun too.
yeah. I don't know if you're aware, Jason, I wrote a book called The Power of Having Fun. And that's exactly the premise, that taking that time to have that fun actually helps you be more successful in whatever career you're in. So thank you for being an excellent example and case study of that principle.
I definitely agree with that. Yeah.
All right. So unfortunately, we need to start wrapping this up. So
Sure.
It's been a real pleasure talking with you and reconnecting and hearing your life story. I'm just so excited about the success that you had.
Well, thank you.
Okay, so this is the point in this discussion where I like to summarize for my audience, because what I believe in is that it's not so much about just the knowledge that you gain, but the actions that you take on that knowledge. You use the word applied science. So we're going to apply what we've learned from you. And so I'm going to suggest 3 possible actions, specific things that someone can do this week, not in a month, not in a year, but something right now that they can do so that your success story might become a part of their success story. And then after I share my 3, Jason, feel free to chime in with 1 or 2 of your own.
Sure.
All right. So the first thing that I wrote down was to take a risk, try something new or difficult. That's what you did when you had that opportunity to go all the way from Orem, Utah to go to school at Harvard. And that was a big risk. And it took a lot of planning and changes, and it paid off for you. And I'm guessing there's at least 1 or 2 people listening to this that have something that they're considering doing that's a risk. It takes a lot of work and effort, and maybe they're holding themselves back from doing it. I would encourage you to, as long as the outcome of that risk would be fantastic, perhaps take that risk, plan for it, do something about it. The other one is, I'm going to highlight that principle that we've heard now several times from my guests, but it's so powerful. Know your audience and know their background. At some point in anyone's career, you have to persuade people and convince people. To do that effectively, you want to stop, take the time to get to know the person that you're talking to, and adapt the way that you communicate to them. Just like Jason has done over and over in his career, adapting that scientific knowledge so that someone who's not scientific can understand it and be persuaded to invest in what he's doing. And then the last one, this came up a few times, was that idea of community, right? The people that you associated with at Harvard opened your mind and showed you things that you could do differently. I think you had also even a great community in high school, if I remember. You had these friends who you guys were all reinforcing each other, creating a culture that was great to be smart, great to be educated, and you all supported people in that. And even with your hobbies, right? You have a community for music, and that is encouraging you to spend time on that hobby and get the strength from that. So for someone listening to this, consider the community that you're in. Are they building you up? Are they teaching you things? Are they encouraging you to be more? If so, great, do more of it. If not, perhaps make an adjustment to a community that's going to support and reinforce you more. So those are just 3 that I found. What's something that you would contribute to that list of action items, Jason?
That is a wonderful list. So one thing I might add, I've been kind of reflecting on where I am in my career now and thinking back, is I think it's important to reassess your values from time to time. And let me explain what I mean by that. Not the core of who you are, but what sort of things are important to you, and how do you deal with, allocating your time between work, family, hobbies, things like that. I think a recognition that we kind of swim in the sea of different influences and currents, and that situation is fluid and changing, means that it can be very helpful to take an honest look at what's important to you now. I know that the things that were most important to me as, say, like a 25-year-old single person are very different from a 45-year-old married person with kids. So I think a recognition that there will be ebbs and flows in what is important to you and how you allocate your time. I've achieved enough age to look back on that and realize that that's a valuable exercise, I think.
I love it. And I think that's something someone could do once a year, once every couple of years, and sit down and reassess. Am I still in the direction that I want it to be going?
Right. And recognizing that direction may change and it's not a bad thing.
Yeah, exactly. Jason, I'm so glad that we had this conversation. We need to talk more in the future, not just on this interview. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom and your knowledge and your personality with us. I think a lot of people will benefit from what you shared.
Well, I don't know how wise it was, but I had a blast, and I very much appreciate you inviting me on.
Yeah. Thank you again, my friend. And thank you, everyone, for listening. Remember, do something about what you heard. Make Jason's success story a part of your success story. Pick one action that came to mind and do it this week. Thank you so much for listening.
You've been listening to the Dave Crenshaw Success Project, hosted by my dad, Dave Crenshaw, and produced by Invaluable Incorporated. Research and assistant production by Victoria Bidez. Sound editing by Mark Lamerjazy. Voiceover by me, Darcy Crenshaw. And the music is by Ryan Brady via Pond 5 Licensing. Please subscribe to the Dave Crenshaw Success Project on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you like to get your podcasts. If you have a suggestion for someone my dad might like to interview, please send it to guest@davecrenshaw.com. And please don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. See you next time.